So when we go to vote on November 6th for the candidates of our choosing, there's also going to be 12 constitutional amendments on the ballot as well. Two of the amendments on the ballot really stuck out to me. One is Amendment 4, which will restore over 1 million former felons their voting rights, many who are black, and the other is Amendment 13, which will end Greyhound racing. So I reached out to Cohen, a freelance journalist, who wrote an in-depth piece about Amendment 4 on how it came about and the history of the Florida law designed to take away voting rights disproportionately from black people. I also talked to Carlos Smith, Florida State House Representative for District 49. Carlos is very knowledgeable and passionate about getting Amendment 13 passed. First up is Rachel, as you'll hear her talk to me about Amendment 4. Earlier this month, you wrote a piece over on The Intercept about Amendment 4, giving felons their voting rights back that's to be voted on in November here in Florida. Where exactly did you first hear about this?
I first heard about it because I was working on a different story about voting rights and looking at some of the, big things coming up. And Amendment 4 is definitely easily one of the most consequential, important voting rights initiatives happening anywhere in the country this year.
How many other states don't give felons their voting rights back?
Florida is unique in a lot of ways. Only Florida, Iowa, and Kentucky sort of have this, indefinite disenfranchisement after someone completes their sentence, but a lot of other states sort of withhold the vote in other ways, like maybe you have finished your time in prison, but you can't get it until you finish your parole or you finish your probation. But Florida is definitely the most notorious state in the country for withholding the vote. 27% of all disenfranchised felons in the country are in Florida.
So how many votes does it take for that to get on the ballot?
Well, it was what's known as a sort of citizen-led petition, and you need to collect 766,000 signatures from registered voters to get it on the ballot, and it takes several years, and then the state has to sort of prove it and check the signatures. Organizers collected 799,000 signatures from registered voters, so that's what they were able to do, but you needed a minimum 766,000.
Now that it's on our ballot down here, how much does it need to be voted on to pass?
So it's actually a high bar in Florida. In a lot of states, when they have constitutional amendments on the ballot, you just need, a majority, so, 50% plus one. But in Florida, you need 60% of all voters who cast a ballot to vote yes. So that is pretty steep. So that's how much the Amendment 4 is going to have to take to pass.
How did this law originally come about? I can't imagine this was recent.
Oh no, it's very old. In fact, it first came about in the 1868 Constitution. This was happening, at the time when citizens were receiving new rights and freedoms and powers from the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which were recently ratified. And a lot of states, especially southern states, including Florida, were looking for ways to undermine some of the rights and freedoms and protections that citizens were going to get. And so one of the ways that states did that, including Florida, was by enacting provisions that would take away the right to vote from, and they specifically looked for sort of crimes or situations that they believed black citizens were more likely to have been found guilty of. So, one of the examples that I use in the piece is that in South Carolina, thievery and adultery were crimes that warranted taking your right to vote away, but murder wasn't. So anyway, a bunch of states, including Florida, enacted these provisions in their constitution, and it's been basically unchanged in Florida for that entire time. You can get your right to vote if you apply for clemency once you finish your sentence, but the state is really slow and so rarely gives out clemency, and it's a very arbitrary system. So in effect, you basically don't get the right to vote back in most cases.
So I just want to follow up on that for a second. You just said you could commit murder over in South Carolina and you can keep your rights to vote, but if you stole, you lost them.
Yeah, that's not anymore, but that was an example of what it was.
Are there any exceptions to who gets their rights back on this amendment, or is it all felons get their voting rights back?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there are two categories of exceptions: those who have committed murder and those who have a felony sex offense, a sex offender. This is actually pretty significant because the whole amendment is being campaigned on this idea of second chances, and once you've paid your debts to society, you should be able to rejoin, civic society and be able to vote. And so it is pretty significant, I think, that these groups of people are being excluded. There are, of course, political, pragmatic arguments to be made for it. You can say, we just think that it's going to be too hard to reach that 60% threshold if they were included. But, the sad part is by excluding them, you're just further marginalizing them. They're going to become even, it seems like it would be that much harder to ever restore the right to vote. So anyway, the amendment covers an amazingly large number of people. It could restore the right to vote automatically to 1.5 million Florida citizens, which is huge. That's just so many people. But I think it is important to remember that there are these carve-outs for sex offenders and people who've committed murder. And, I think if they have paid their debts to society, ideally they would be able to vote as well. But that's not what's in the language of the petition.
So who's behind this movement? When did this movement start?
So the movement is being led by a really inspiring guy named Desmond Meade, who had completed his prison sentence. He served 15 years in prison. He had been convicted of drug charges, but then later convicted for possession of a firearm as a felon. And he is part of a group called the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, and that's a statewide grassroots organization led by returning citizens. Returning citizens is the phrase, used to call former felons who have returned and completed their sentences. It's sort of a more positive frame label than ex-felons or former felons. So they've been leading this, and they started collecting signatures for the initiative in 2015.
Obviously, the Voting Rights Act passed. How did this constitutional amendment here down in Florida not get overturned through the Voting Rights Act? I can't imagine there weren't lawsuits filed to get this dismissed.
There was a major effort in 2000 to try to overturn this provision in the Constitution, and one of the legal arguments was that it was a violation of the Voting Rights Act. They also said it was, a violation of the 14th and 15th Amendment. It was a class action suit on behalf of more than 600,000 Florida citizens, and arguing that the provision was discriminatory. The lower court agreed, but the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit in 2005 rejected it, saying that the plaintiffs did not successfully prove that the state had clear discriminatory intent. So that was a really big blow. That was sort of the big attempt to strike it down, and they weren't able to succeed on that argument.
They're not, I assume, in court right now again, because usually you would refile a lawsuit. So I assume they're not filing a lawsuit right at this moment while this is being voted on?
Well, actually, there is a separate lawsuit called Hand v. Scott, and that's currently making its way through the courts now. It's sort of been on a separate track to this amendment process. It's also taking aim at the provision, but it's trying to make a different argument than the people made in 2000. These plaintiffs, and the plaintiffs are also people who have already completed their sentences and probation and parole, and they want to vote. And the argument they're making in this case is that the process that Florida uses to determine who should get clemency is arbitrary and violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th and First Amendments. So this is a new and sort of side effort to overturn this provision, and in February, a lower court agreed. Then they had arguments in front of the appellate court in the summer, and that's sort of in limbo right now. If Amendment 4 passes in November, then this lawsuit would be rendered moot because all of the plaintiffs in the case would get their right to vote back. If Amendment 4 doesn't pass, then, fingers crossed for the lawsuit, basically.
So with this lawsuit, because we talked about earlier how there are people excluded from this amendment, if this lawsuit, let's say the amendment doesn't pass and the lawsuit goes through, and the lawsuit wins, would those people that were excluded from this amendment get their rights back, or is it still the same target?
So basically, and this is a good question, this was a question I asked when I was doing the reporting, if they win the lawsuit, that doesn't mean that everyone would get automatic restoration, which is what Amendment 4 would grant. So everyone would basically automatically get their rights to vote back if the ballot initiative passes. But if the lawsuit wins, that requires the state to set up a non-arbitrary way of dealing with clemency. And so the excluded groups under Amendment 4 would be included under, theoretically under that non-arbitrary way, but it doesn't mean that they would get their rights to vote back anytime soon either. And the lawyer for the Han v. Scott case says, it's possible that whatever they establish, if they were to win and the state came up with a new system, it's not impossible that new system wouldn't have its own constitutional challenges, like maybe they are that could be discriminatory in different ways. So basically, I think the summary of what I'm trying to say is, yes, sex offenders and people who've committed murder would benefit from a new clemency system like everybody else if the lawsuit were to win, but it's not the same as, that doesn't mean that everyone would get the right to vote back promptly in the way that Amendment 4 would grant automatic restoration.
You've mentioned the arbitrary process for clemency twice now. Can you explain to me how that exactly works? How do you go through for clemency here in Florida?
So I don't have total, I can't explain it in great detail, but what I do know is that the people who decide it, basically, there are no clear standards. The governor has extraordinary power to veto decisions, and it's not systematic in any way. It's not seen as fair. The Governor Rick Scott in 2011 actually changed it to just say, once you complete your sentence, you have to wait 5 years before you can apply for clemency, which wasn't even how it used to be. And considering the whole process can take a decade or more, you're then asking people to wait another 15 years or so after they've already gone through prison and done parole and probation and whatever. So it's arbitrary in the sense that, no one looks at this process and thinks, okay, this is a fair thing. I can trust that once I serve my time and I apply for clemency, I am going to get it. They're very slow, and it's just not sort of guaranteed that you'll get it, even if you've checked all your boxes and done your time.
So as you heard from Rachel, Florida presently passed this law designed to take away black people's voting rights. Next, you're going to hear from Carlos on why voting on Amendment 13 is important. When I spoke to Carlos, he was out in his district working on his re-election campaign. So although the interview is audible, the audio quality is inconsistent. What is Amendment 13?
So Amendment 13 will ban cruel and inhumane Greyhound racing in the state of Florida, which has really been a black eye on our state. Many people don't realize that there's only 17 Greyhound races. 11 of them are in the Sunshine State. And the reason it needs to be shut down because every 3 days a Greyhound will die on a Florida track. They die from things like heat exhaustion, broken necks, broken backs. They're euthanized for minor injuries like broken legs. They've died of heat exhaustion, electrocution, and they're also confined when they're not racing in cages that are barely large enough for them to stand up or turn around on an average about 20 to 23 hours a day. That's not an opinion. That is according to state investigators who are tasked with regulating the Greyhound industry, and that's what they have documented over the years. The statistic of a Greyhound dying on a Florida track every 3 days is also not an opinion. It's based on the statistics that they are required to report to the state of Florida. Every time a Greyhound dies, the tracks have to submit that information to the Division of Pari-Mutuel Wagering, and the average death of once every 3 days is based on the information that's been compiled over the last several years. So this is something that we really need to act on. There's been much debate about whether or not this belongs in the Constitution, and I think that discussion has more to do with how broken the Florida legislature has become and less to do with whether or not the issue at hand needs to be on the Constitution. If I could compare this issue to issues like fair districts, medical cannabis, the potential of an assault weapons ban being put on the Florida Constitution or raising the minimum wage to a living wage. These are all issues that in a perfect world don't necessarily belong in the Florida Constitution, but there's a reason that that's the route advocates have had to take over and over again, because the Florida legislature can't be trusted to act on the issues that matter. So the only mechanism left is through a ballot initiative and by changing the Florida Constitution.
How did this get on the ballot in the first place?
It got on the ballot because it was placed on the ballot by the Constitution Revision Commission after much debate and much opposition from the industry. The industry, meaning the dog trainers, the dog breeders who make a living off of this cruel spectacle, they have a vested interest in keeping the industry alive, so they oppose it.
So I see the Florida Farm Bureau is also against banning greyhound racing. Where did the Florida Farm Bureau come in on this?
Well, what does the NRA have to do with it either? The NRA has gotten involved because they have interpreted this in some bizarre way that they believe that this is a foot in the door or a camel's nose under the tent to banning hunting in the state of Florida. That's not what it is. Greyhound racing has been banned in other states, several other states, and we've not seen a ban on hunting in other states or any other absurd, ridiculous objection that people have. We've never seen that happen in other states. What has happened in other states is when greyhound racing has been banned and nothing more. And the sky didn't fall. But then also didn't have dogs dying on track every several days because they're being subjected to some cruel human spectacle for our entertainment. I think what happened is many folks have tried to overcomplicate this matter. And really, it's as simple as it sounds. If you want greyhound racing to continue in the state of Florida and you want dogs to be subjected to cruel treatment, inhumane treatment, and possible death for the purposes of human entertainment, then by all means, vote no on Amendment 13. But if you want to end that and you oppose the spectacle that is greyhound racing, then you should vote yes on Amendment 13, and we can finally move on from this black eye on the state of Florida. And that's not necessarily a liberal issue. You know, this is a bipartisan issue that has found support from Republicans and Democrats on both sides of the aisle. I recently did a digital ad featuring Republican lawmaker Mike Hill from the Florida Panhandle where we agreed that we don't agree on really anything except for voting yes on Amendment 13. I'm really, really proud of that. I'm proud of the diverse coalition of individuals who are getting behind this amendment, and I think that just kind of underscores how common sense a measure this is.
So I want to follow up on that. You just talked about how you have bipartisan support, and you obviously shot that digital ad with Republican lawmaker Mike Hill. So why hasn't this just been passed in the legislature and signed by our Governor Rick Scott? It sounds like there's a lot of support for this.
There is a lot of support. But unfortunately, what there also is there is campaign contributions that have also gone to both political parties and both sides of the aisle that has made it really, really hard to get consensus from lawmakers in the Florida legislature. Really, the simplest way to put it is the fact that a handful of Republican leaders in Tallahassee who control the process have refused year after year to address the issue. The issue is decoupling because the industry itself is on the decline. What happens is if you go to a greyhound track in Florida today and you look around, it's mostly an empty track. There's not even really a lot of people who are paying money to watch this cruel sport. The reason why is because its popularity has declined and people quite frankly don't want to see it. So one would think that the free market would eventually put an end to greyhound racing on its own. But that's not the case in Florida because we have an outdated law that actually mandates, there's a government mandate by the state of Florida on live greyhound racing for those venues who want to do card tables and that type of gambling indoors. So literally you have greyhound track owners who have no interest in racing greyhound dogs who are required by law to have 100 live races per year. That's the Florida law, so that they can continue to have card games indoors in their facility. That's ridiculous. It's resulted in an absolute cluster in the Florida legislature that we can never get consensus on this
Where is Rick Scott on this position here? As governor of Florida, has he taken a side on this issue, or has he just completely ignored it?
I have no idea. I've never heard him speak on either side of the issue. I don't think that he's ever been a leader on this issue.
Let's say come November, this amendment is passed overwhelmingly, or at least by the 60% that's required. What is the process of ending Greyhound racing? Does it just end as of the next day, or?
No, they have. I think the way that it's worded is it has 2 years. They have 2 years to phase it out. But the reality is, of the 11, there's 11 Greyhound racing tracks in Florida. 10 of them operate at a profit loss. So that just underscores again the reality, which is that there's a government mandate that forces them to participate in live racing against their will, and they're actually losing money. They're losing profits at 10 out of the 11 facilities because no one is watching. No one is paying and betting on these dogs. There's one facility in the state of Florida that still profits. That's the Stanford Kennel Club, and even that is waning. The interest is on the decline. So it's an unfortunate situation that, we've gotten here because of inaction from the Florida legislature. And, if anyone believes that the Florida legislature is going to act on this issue anytime soon, I have a bridge to sell them.
So, obviously, you're very passionate about this issue. I see you talk about it all the time. Who brought this issue to you? How did you learn about this issue?
I learned about the issue before I was elected. Before I got to the Florida legislature, I was the legislative aide for 2 former lawmakers, first for Scott Randolph and then for Joe Saunders. And when I was up there, I met with a lot of the advocates who care about animal welfare, people from the Humane Society of the United States, people from Grade 2K USA, and other organizations, ASPCA, the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and they got the issue on my radar, and it got me interested because of, not only how cruel a sport this is, but how, it just defies all logic. There's a government mandate for this racing to take place even when there's no profits involved. The only people that are profiting are the dog breeders and the dog trainers, not the dog track facility itself, not the venue that houses any of these things. They're operating at a loss. That's when I got really interested and became an advocate. I passed a bill off of the Florida House in 2017, off of the House floor, that in the very least banned the use of harmful anabolic steroids, which has been, it's been toxic to some of these dogs who have been given these anabolic steroids by their trainers. Unfortunately, it didn't pass into law because the year that I passed it in the House, it didn't pass in the Senate. So just like with everything else, we weren't able to get any traction on the issue because a handful of people who controlled this process didn't want to take action and didn't want to leave.
What will happen to these dogs if this amendment passes and they start phasing out the dog racing? What will happen to these dogs?
The same thing will happen to them as what happened in Massachusetts when Greyhound racing was banned in the state of Massachusetts. There will be a coordinated effort by animal advocacy organizations and adoption agencies to adopt these dogs out. And that's not to adopt them out just in the state of Florida. They'll be adopting them out across the country and across the world to make sure that they are taken in by a loving family. I know I myself will be adopting a Greyhound dog once this passes as well and be rescuing them. So we all plan on being a part of the effort. But that's just another issue that I think is important, which is the industry, this cruel sport alive, is basically putting allegations out there saying that if it passes, that all of the dogs are going to be euthanized, which is false, one. But two, it just kind of begs the question, are these really the people that we trust to be taking care of these animals, people who are essentially threatening to euthanize them if the amendment passes? Look, there's been documented cases of animal abuse against these dogs for years and years and years. There's a reason why people are passionate about making this end.
You're talking about there's documented animal abuse here. How are these animals not taken away from these trainers? How are these people not prosecuted for animal abuse?
Well, a lot of times they are. The documented abuse is from trainers who have had their licenses revoked, trainers who have been brought to court, who have had charges brought against them. Some of them have been thrown out because of technicalities and how the state runs its drug testing program. Some of them have had charges brought against them and had licenses revoked. All of these cases have outcomes, and they've all been very well documented in the news. I mean, I can't tell you how many headlines I read about dogs who have been given cocaine and trainers who have had their licenses suspended, and we see videos of dogs running on tracks where their necks have been broken, videos of dogs getting electrocuted by the bunny going around the track. I mean, it all exists out there.
I'd like to once again thank both Rachel and Carlos for taking time out of their busy schedules to talk about voting for both of these amendments. I hope come Election Day, when you go to cast your ballot, you vote in favor for both of these amendments. I know I will.